I'm Amy Finley. It's Labor Day in Vermont, and this is Across the Fence. Did you know that in the U.S., 1 in every 10 workers works in the food system? Take this tomato. It gets grown, picked, transported, stored in a warehouse, sold, prepared, maybe by folks like these, and eventually ends up in one of our waste systems. At every one of those steps, labor. That makes today the perfect day to honor the millions of people who feed us by taking a close look at labor in the food system.
Without food system workers, we don't eat. But when most people think about challenges in the food system, they think about disappearing farmland, vulnerable ecosystems, climate change, who has access to healthy local food, all important issues. What we don't think about is labor. Food system workers face some of the toughest conditions in the country, whether they're processing meat, picking produce, washing dishes, making lattes, ringing up groceries, or cooking your dinner. The work is underpaid and often undervalued, and done mostly by vulnerable people. Jobs are precarious, often menial, and frequently dangerous. Profits flow up, wage theft is rampant, and it's legal to pay tipped workers as little as $2.13 an hour. In 1960, responding to the pay and conditions faced by migrant food pickers, Edward R. Morrow described America's food system as a harvest of shame. For workers, it hasn't much changed. In a country already struggling with hunger, poor nutrition, and rising food prices, the question is, what can a just food system for workers look like? And how do we get there?
Happy Labor Day, Vermont. Big questions, important questions. And to help us explore them, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Theresa Mares to the show. She's a UVM Associate Professor of Anthropology and Food Systems and the co-author of a new book, Will Work for Food, Labor Across the Food Chain. The book's being released later this month by the University of California Press. We're grateful to get a sneak preview today. Theresa, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. Full disclosure, you and I have history.
We do, good history.
Very good history. Yeah, I know that actually sort of sounds like a bad setup. You were one of my all-time favorite professors when I was doing my graduate work in food systems at UVM.
Thank you.
And that also means that I know a lot about you and your background and your work, but I thought it would be great to have you start us off today by telling everybody else, why are you so passionate about the issue of labor in the food system?
Oh, that's such a great question to start with, and it's one that has a little bit of a long answer, but I'll try to keep it short. So my research over the last 20 years or so has looked at basically the intersections of migration and food, ranging from questions about how do immigrants living in the United States meet their food needs, how do they make sure that their cultural connections to food can stay constant, and more recently that has moved into looking at the experiences of food workers and farm workers. And so I got to UVM in 2011. I was hired in the anthropology department and started doing research on the experiences of dairy workers in the state, and especially started out looking at how they were accessing food in really rural, often very cold environments.
Right.
And how that, was one question among many that I have about food.
I think I remember too that you were even looking at things like how comfortable did they feel going off the farm in order to go and get food?
Yeah, how, if you don't necessarily have access to transportation, if you don't speak the language, how are you accessing those food needs and food preferences? But I think I couldn't not think about the labor dimensions of those questions. And, I was learning a lot about dairy, learning a lot about the work in dairy, and
getting close to people who were working in dairy.
Yeah, exactly, and doing ethnography, which is, what sometimes people call intentionally or deeply hanging out with people.
Deeply hanging out,
deeply
I love that.
Hanging out, yeah. So I, was doing ethnographic work and learning a lot about the food system, learning a lot about the experiences of farm workers, and then in connection with my colleague and my co-author, Laura Ann Minkoff-Surin, started thinking about, well, how do these farm workers connect to retail workers? How do these farm workers connect to restaurant workers? And so this more recent book is about the labor system as a whole, the labor chain as a whole. But when it comes back to it, what's really interesting and something that we spent some time on is that I've spent a lot of my life doing food work. I grew up in the back of a Baskin-Robbins ice cream store that my parents owned. I spent most of my college years and grad school years paying my way through school doing food work.
As did I.
As so many do.
As so many do.
And so it's kind of been a full circle moment where I'm like, oh, there's actually something that my life has really revolved around, with thinking about labor, doing that labor, and more recently, putting the dots together, or connecting the dots about all of the different kind of food work that happens.
We tried to set this up in our introduction. Labor is not necessarily the first thing that people think about. They tend to think the ecological issues and the health issues. The ecological issues and health issues.
Hugely important.
These are important.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Why though? So your book talks about the food chain. Okay. Food chain, food system. What's the difference between these things? Right. Yes. Like maybe you could explain that and explain like what's that relationship to labor.
Yeah, and I think there's ways that those terms can be used interchangeably. But so we chose food chain for this book because both for my colleague and I, we've been really inspired by the work of the Food Chain Workers Alliance, and that organization is a national organization that advocates for better labor protections, better health care, better everything for food workers. And so because we've been so inspired by the work, that's how we chose to frame our book. Food system, I think, can go beyond labor. I think that we can think about food systems, from the biophysical dimensions of food systems and, seeds and all of those things, which of course all of that does involve labor. But I think we chose food chain because it really allows us to think about the steps that food takes, like we saw through these different sectors of the food system.
Right, and that was actually a good thought exercise for me too, to really try to go, okay, so it starts with the growing, and then we have to get to the picking, and at all of these different steps along the way, there are people who are touching that food, who are involved in the food.
Absolutely.
I want to circle back around to the ecological issues and things for just a second, because sometimes that's been called like the good food movement, and it might be something that people are more, like what's the, not the difference between, say, the good, how do these two intersect with each other?
Yeah, so I always come back to some very academic language around different parts of sustainability. And I think that, dating back to like 1991, when we have this really foundational essay called The Social Side of Sustainability, more critical food systems thinkers have been arguing, okay, yes, ecological dimensions of food are absolutely important. Environmental, along with those ecological, also financial, right? If farmers are not staying in business, we don't have a sustainable food system. But I think all of those questions around equity, whether it's about, are people well fed or are food and farm workers themselves getting enough food, those are much more of the social dimensions. And so to me, I don't think it's about privileging one or the other, but I think certainly within a lot of our mainstream food movements, we've seen a lot of attention to ecological and economic dimensions, sometimes at the expense of those social dimensions. And, I often describe it to my students as like, if you have a three-legged stool and one leg is too short, it's not very stable. So if we're thinking about, really comprehensive reforms and comprehensive transformation in our food system, I think we have to think about all of those dimensions.
Yes. When we're talking about labor, one of the things that has always been interesting to me is that oftentimes the type of labor that is done in the food system is referred to as unskilled labor. And as somebody who has worked in kitchens before, I'm like, really? But is it really? Is it unskilled?
No, absolutely not. And I think that what we make the point of that in this book is that it's not about skill, it's about value, right? And I think when we look at that skill, the deep environmental knowledge, even the social skills that you have to have in the food system, that is not a lack of skill. I think it reflects more about how our society values that work. But I think anyone who tries to grow their own food, anyone who tries to cook a meal,
anyone like me who has tried and failed to grow their own food, I'm still working on it.
Yeah, right. That involves a tremendous amount of skill and knowledge, and I think that that's something that connects, food work with other kinds of work that is devalued in society. is that it's not about a lack of skill, it's about a lack of social value to me.
I would oftentimes say this to my students in the foods lab, is that maybe we're not doing a lot of favors when we say anyone can cook.
No.
You know, it sounds great, you know, in a Pixar movie, but it also conveys the idea that you don't need to know anything to be able to go and cook meals for yourself. And it did not actually match their lived experience, or probably anyone watching the show's lived experience, which is there are so many questions, everything from like, where am I buying the groceries? How am I doing my budgeting?
Is this milk still good to drink?
Exactly. There is so much that you have to need to know. Okay. So something else that I did love in your book is you talked about the bear.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, if you do not know the bear, let me tell you a little bit about the bear. So the bear is a streaming show on Hulu. It follows a chef, a Chicago chef, who's trying to rekindle a family restaurant, and eventually getting into fine dining. So there's a whole lot of dining things. Restaurant people sometimes are like, I can't watch it, it makes me feel so stressed, because it really does a good job of capturing the restaurant stress. You used it in the book. Very effectively. How?
Well, I love the show. I mean, there's that point. I think it's a show that I really enjoy watching, regardless of my academic interests. But actually, at the encouragement of the press, they were like, well, how are you going to make this book accessible to a broader audience? And I'm kind of a pop culture nerd. And so I was like, well, you know, I think that, you know, where
cooking is so hot right now.
Yeah, cooking is so hot right now. Well, it's also that, like, you know, some of my references are becoming a little dated. But these newer references are ones that I think are going to be persistent over time. And I think the bear, what I appreciate about the bear is that it actually does a fairly good job at showing how often sort of high-end chefs get a lot of credit when there's actually a lot of people in the back of the house. And so where some food media doesn't really show the complexity of back of the house labor and these, you know, relationships and the struggles, I think that it does a pretty good job at doing that. We were also hoping that
we have this lone artist conception of a chef.
Yeah, absolutely, which is a typically white male chef, right?
Typically a white male chef.
And I think what that show does well is show how dependent often restaurants are on the labor of folks of color, right? And immigrants. And I think that that is where it's a bit more accurate than some of the other representations.
Yes, and in fact, actually, one of the graphics that jumped out at me in your book was a representation of labor in the food system. I mean, it's like, and it's kind of stunning because that food service sector is really big. It's like 56%, something like that.
The majority of food workers are in service, and that has changed over time. You know, that's where we've seen the most growth, but I think it makes sense given what our own kind of food habits look like these days, right? Tonight I'm going to grab takeout. I'm not going to cook. And
so many of us depend on other people to make our food for us.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think too, you had some stats in there, and I don't want to put you on the spot.
So many stats.
But also too, in that 54% overrepresentation by BIPOC.
Yep, absolutely. By women, immigrants, and folks of color. And so, you know, I think that comes back to our social value, right? How do we value these workers? How do we value the work that they do? And I think, you know, for good reason, you know, those jobs, while they are not unskilled, are often low entry, right? That they are places where you can become trained fairly quickly and where you have a lot of transferability, right? Like I have a very niche job. I'm a food anthropologist. Like, I'm not going to go if I want to move to Hawaii, which, you know, sounds great sometimes.
You have to do some planning.
Yeah, right? Whereas, like, if you are working in the food system, often those skills are very transferable. And so I think that we do see, you know, a disproportionate number of people of color working in the food system, and there's been some great organizations that have drawn attention to that and really think about, well, how is labor justice and food justice also a project of racial justice? And I think that's really important.
Yes. I had a COVID flashback.
Oh, yeah.
When you started talking about essential workers in the book. Yes, and I love it. And you are describing frontline food workers as essential. So what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, so this book was a COVID project. I think that's an important recognition, is that, you know, when COVID started really, you know, becoming so impactful on our daily lives, researchers, especially those like me who do field work with other people, were like, well, what do I do? And Laura Ann and I had both been teaching this food and labor class, her at Syracuse and me here at UVM. And we started thinking about how, we needed better teaching materials. So this book really started out as something that we would use in classes. We started those conversations just prior to, in late 2019. And so early 2020, what we started seeing, right, is all of these conversations about essential labor, all of these conversations about where do we get our food from, and if we see this big shock and disruption to our food system, who is doing that work, often, risking their own lives.
It was really a moment where it became very clear that there were people upon whom we really depended,
absolutely,
truly, to be able to get about our daily lives.
Yeah, and it had a double side to it, right? That I think with essential work, we do see a recognition of how core and critical they are, right? To the point where we had executive orders demanding that meatpacking plants were kept open.
Right.
But there's also, from the labor side of things, there was an argument that essential can also translate to sacrificial, right? And that we saw disproportionate rates of COVID infection, disproportionate numbers of deaths due to COVID in places like meatpacking facilities. And so that idea of essential is one that we really dig into in the book, because absolutely the labor of these workers is core to our nation, is core to our own food security, but that often means that their lives are on the line. And that's really can be devastating.
Let's talk about tips.
Oh boy,
Okay, so the tip wage. The tip wage, I'm going to see if I can do a quick summary of what the tip wage is. So the tip wage is there's a federal tip wage, which is $2.13 an hour. Has not changed since the 1990s, 1991, I believe. States can set their own minimum tip wage. So that does not mean that every person who works for tips is making $2.13, but it can be. It can be the case, and in numerous states it is the case. Vermont has a tip wage that's set to 50% of whatever the minimum wage is. So that means that in Vermont, the tip wage now is $7.40 an hour. Many people are making more than this, but we don't know. And then that's kind of my question is how do you know whether or not someone is making what someone is making?
You don't. And I think that I've drawn a lot upon the work of organizations like Rock United, Restaurant Opportunity Center United, and the One Fair Wage campaign, which has really drawn attention to how uneven tipped labor is, right? And we do see some really, in my opinion, good steps at raising the tipped wage in cities and in states, but in the vast majority of states, that $2.13 wage persists. And I think that there's this often, there's a mistaken understanding or a mistaken assumption that, people working in dining are making so much money, right? And I think
tip creep, and people are feeling this, right? I mean, it's been in the news a bit, this idea of tip creep. You're being asked to tip.
Just ask this little question.
Yeah, exactly. Just ask this one question. I mean, people do experience. How do you navigate that yourself, knowing what you know?
Oh, I mean, I tend to be a good tipper, and I think that
I'm a good tipper too.
I think most people who have worked in food systems or food work have that sort of, that.
It's important to me.
Yeah, it is important to me as well. And I think that, I do what I can, because I do have the ability to do so, and I know so many people do not. But I am hesitant to think that tipping is the answer, right? And I think that, so many food companies and food businesses are really struggling, and, moving that compensation onto the customer is often a way of staying afloat. And that is a problem, right? That's a more fundamental problem. But yeah, I think that tip creep is a real concern, but I also, from the systems angle is like, well, why is that happening?
Yeah, that's so let's go back to that idea of essential workers. I mean, essential also, it implies that we can't do without them, which means that perhaps we owe them something.
Absolutely.
What did they deserve? Like, for example, what is a livable wage?
I mean, I think a livable wage is, of course, going to depend on the place where we're talking about, right? And what is the cost of housing? What is the cost of food? That livable wages have to be in line with where people are living, right? And what that means in Seattle is different from what that means in, my hometown, Fort Collins, Colorado.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the Fight for 15?
Yeah, I think the Fight for 15 has been a really powerful organization for arguing that a livable wage is no less than $15 an hour, right? And that $15 an hour is a livable wage at minimum for most places. And we've seen our own elected representatives very in support of the fight for 15, and you know, that gives me some joy. And I think it also, you know, the 15 number, right, is one that is, well, there's some alliteration. The fight for 15 sounds good, but also it is a livable wage at bare minimum, right? And so I think that the fight for 15 has been really powerful. It's been especially important in galvanizing in food work and food service work. But I think that we also don't want to say like that is the only aspiration that we need to look for.
Okay, I want to shift gears here a bit. So we are a big country with millions of people who need to eat.
Yes.
How hard is it to feed a country on that scale?
It's really difficult, right? And I think that, you know, it's a difficult thing, and I think it's especially a difficult thing when we see ongoing attacks on things like SNAP benefits and school lunches. You know, I think that the question of feeding the nation, of course, is one that also brings up tariffs. It brings up all of these really
brings up so many things that we're all struggling with right now.
So many topics right now, right? And but the thing is, and I think that this is where, you know, some of the earlier work that I've done and reading is that there is enough food to go around, right? It's not a question of production. It's all of the middle steps. It's all about the distribution. It's about the logistics. It's about not letting food waste, right? And so it is a difficult task, but also it's a difficult task because of how the food system is structured. And I always think back to one of my, you know, a thinker that I'm very inspired by, Eric Jimenez, and he's like, the food system is not broken. It's working exactly as it was designed. And I think that we do need a redesign to make sure that there's more equity across the food system, but also that the food that is grown is getting into, you know, the bellies of people.
Yeah, and this is also not anything new.
No.
We talked about Edward R. Murrow and the, you know, harvest of shame at the very beginning, and that was part of where the idea, where the shame came in, was the idea that Americans were well-fed, because he talked about we have the best-fed Americans, the most well-fed people on the planet, that we were well-fed because of the costs of being a food worker. So, but that actually, how well-fed are Americans now?
Not that well-fed. And
it's a conundrum.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up at the beginning. That I still show that film to my food classes because it could have as easily been filmed yesterday, right? In some ways, different demographics, of course, of food workers, but we're well-fed in comparison to other nations. But when you really look at the breakdown of, you know, food insecurity, when you look at corporate profit, when you look at where the money in the food system goes, there's all kinds of...
And also the types of food we're eating.
Absolutely.
Like we don't enjoy equal nutritional outcomes.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, and we have a lot of problems, health problems that are associated with our diets as well.
And, you know, we can't separate food from all of these other conditions, right? What do housing markets look like? What do job markets look like? That, you know, I think as a systems thinker, food is a really complex system among many complex systems. So Vermonters are lucky because our geography here doesn't lend itself well to the same types of large-scale corporate farms that maybe you would see in my home state of California. When I moved here, Vermont farms were like, what? I mean, one, because they were everywhere. They were visible. In California, they're sort of tucked away and hidden and things. But so what's different about the corporate food system? What does corporate food system introduce? And I'll say that we do have a corporate food system in Vermont, right?
Okay, that was going to be my follow-up question. Are we immune from the problems?
No, we're not. And I think that when you look at dairy, for example, right, dairy in Vermont is the primary product for our agricultural revenue as a state. And that dairy, right, that dairy industry has consolidated immensely, right? It's become very hard for small dairy farms to stay afloat. And the dairy farms that we see now in Vermont, the few that remain when we look over time, right, have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and more corporatized. So I don't think we are immune to those corporate pressures. And
I think that dairy farmers know that immediately. That's like, they understand that.
And they're competing against these really large-scale dairies in the Midwest and in California. So we're not immune to those corporatizing pressures, and you know, all of our food intake is often dependent upon that corporate food system. But I think what we see in a corporate food system that we don't necessarily see when I go to Bread and Butter Farm to pick up my CSA share, right, is that we see a lot of lack of transparency, right? We don't see all of those steps. We don't see where those profits are going. And we don't see those gross inequalities of pay between the frontline workers and the CEOs, right? And what we dig into in this book is just how wealthy those top tier executives are in comparison to those frontline workers.
So much wage disparity.
Yep.
Okay. So believe it or not, we're approaching the end.
Oh my gosh.
I know. It goes so fast. I know. I mean, I was like, let's keep going. I want to do it for another hour. But so what is your final message? What's your final message to our audience if they support essential workers, if they themselves are a frontline food worker? Like, what can they do? We didn't talk a ton about organizing. What can they do?
I mean, I think that locally we can follow organizations like Migrant Justice. We can think about, supporting them. But I think it's also like starting to ask those questions, like, where does this tomato come from? Who was doing this work? And I think when we actually develop a great deal of curiosity about our own food system, about our own experiences of being a food worker and how that connects to others, I think that that's a really good first place to start.
But when we open our eyes to who the food workers are.
Absolutely.
And we can see them.
And that's what we're trying to do in this book, for sure.
Okay. Theresa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's been absolutely the best conversation I could imagine having on Labor Day.
Thanks so much.
Okay. The book is Will Work for Food, Labor Across the Food Chain. If you were inspired by our conversation today, order it. It's a great read. Even better, it's an important topic on Labor Day and every day. If you work in the food system, I want to take this chance right now to thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for keeping us fed. And as always, thank you, Vermont. And to the team who makes our program possible, including for me to read it. I'm Amy Finley. This is Across the Fence. Come back and let's learn and explore again tomorrow.